The reading that we're going to spend time with today is from the Christian scriptures, at least the canonical scriptures, those that made the cut. And this is from Mark's Gospel. When the Pharisees with some scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus, they observed that some of his disciples ate their meals with unclean, that is, unwashed hands. For the Pharisees, and in fact all Jews, do not eat without carefully washing their hands, keeping the tradition of the elders. And on coming from the marketplace, they do not eat without purifying themselves. And there are many other things that they have traditionally observed, the purification of cups and jugs and kettles and beds. So the Pharisees and scribes questioned him, "Why do your disciples not follow the tradition of the elders, but instead eat a meal with unclean hands?" Jesus responded, "Well did Isaiah prophesy about you hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines human precepts.' You disregard God's commandment, but cling to human tradition." He summoned the crowd again and said to them, "Hear me, all of you, and understand. Nothing that enters you from outside can defile that person. But the things that come out from within are what defile. From within people, from their hearts, come evil thoughts, unchastity, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, licentiousness, envy, blasphemy, arrogance, folly. All these evils come from within, and they are what defile." There's two layers of teachings in this week's gospel that I want to spend time with today. The first one is the question about the outward practices. And the line specifically that stood out to me was, "These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me, teaching as doctrines human precepts, but disregarding God's commandment." I think we all have had lived experiences of being in environments where there are rules and practices that we're supposed to observe in order to earn God's love, if you will. In the Hebrew tradition, there are many, many, many practices that are observed. It's 300 or 3,000 some laws, I believe, that have to be observed in order to be considered, what's the word I'm looking for? Kosher is not the right word, but something like that. In the Catholic tradition that I grew up in, there were all kinds of rules and regulations and things that have to be observed in order to be loved and accepted by God. These practices, starting with the Jewish tradition, many of these practices were very, very practical in their initial inception. It makes sense to wash your dishes. It makes sense to cleanse your bedclothes. It makes sense to cleanse your body. It makes sense to observe certain food practices that in that time, certain foods were dangerous, because they didn't have proper preservation techniques. They didn't have refrigeration in the Middle East. So the initial inception of a lot of these practices were very, very practical. The problem is that they eventually became divine law or doctrine, in the sense that in order to be loved by God, you have to observe these practices. And we've all had these experiences in our lives where we have been in situations where certain laws were probably had a great idea in the beginning, but ended up not being something that served our relationship with love, but maybe kept us from God. So the thing that pierces through my consciousness, having grown up Catholic, is the whole not eating meat on Friday thing. You know, it used to be you never ate meat on Friday. Then it was don't eat meat on Friday during Lent. Then it's don't eat meat on Friday during Lent, but if St. Patrick's Day falls on a Friday, then you can have your corned beef and cabbage. And, you know, there were two original ideas around that observance. I would say the most benevolent aspect of that practice was really to invite us to be in concert with the poor. So during Lent or at certain times in our life, to be mindful of those that don't have and to be more temperate in our food consumption so that we can remember with gratitude that we can afford to buy meat or we can afford to buy whatever. We can afford to feed ourselves in an abundant way. That was the initial idea around the not eating meat on Friday. And then there's also a political thing that had to do with supporting fishermen. Well, in this day and age, you know, fish is more expensive than hamburger. So how are we really supporting our intimate relationship with God, and how do we make those choices? So ultimately what Jesus is saying is that, is the law getting in the way of you knowing love? And if the law is getting in the way of you knowing and experiencing love or being a source of love in the world, then maybe that law needs to be set aside. And maybe we need to be more attentive to what are the things that help me to know love. Which brings me to the second layer of teaching in this week's gospel. And that has to do with what is it that defiles us? You know, in the Christian and Hebrew, in the Hebrew and Christian traditions, they use this word sin that is indicative of the outward behaviors that are non-loving. In the Christian tradition, they've come down or been handed down with this idea of the 7 deadly sins. So we've got gluttony, lust, wrath, envy, greed, thank you. I'm blanking out here. Gluttony, lust, wrath, envy, greed, sloth, and pride. Those are the 7 deadly sins. I have come to understand that the outward behaviors in and of themselves are not the problem. What actually is defiling us, in a sense, are our fears and our unhealed wounds. And when we are able to take full responsibility for our outward behaviors, so let's say, for example, our outward behavior is envy. We are desirous or believe that we will not be fulfilled until we find love outside of ourselves. And specifically love from another human being, or we're getting trapped in the idea that love has to be earned, or love can be taken away, or love can be denied us. And so we indulge in behaviors that manipulate our ability to receive that love. It's just one example. Lust, in the way that I understand it, is not about sex. Sex can certainly be part of it, but it's much more about power and control. How are we giving our power away? How are we imposing our power and control on another? How are we trying to manipulate or control in order to get what we want? How are we being a bully towards others or being abusive in a sense? Those are the outward behaviors that are reflective of our lack of love within ourselves. Rather, not lack of love, but our disbelief in the love within ourselves. The key to transforming those behaviors might be simply in stop that behavior. Stop your codependent practices, stop being abusive, stop being jealous, stop being lazy, stop being gluttonous, stop taking more than what you need. But what I've learned in 20 years of counseling practice is that behavior modification is not always the easiest thing. It's an effort. It's an effort to stop doing something. It's an effort to start doing something. Jesus modeled an example of healing that was not about the outward behavior, but was about healing what's within that caused that behavior in the first place. So if, for example, one of our compulsive behaviors is compulsive spending, and we're buying more than what we need, we're looking at the media as, well, gosh, if Kim Kardashian's wearing that, then that's what I should be wearing. And we indulge in these behaviors that are unhealthy and compulsive. The key to healing that behavior might be to stop, but the easier, but also the harder way, is to find out what's the unhealed wound that's causing this behavior in the first place. What's my fear? What's the fear that's causing this compulsive behavior? In Authentic Freedom, the curriculum for spiritual formation and self-actualization that I developed, we talk about that specifically. Starting with the 7 deadly sins, or as I call them, 7 deadly compulsions, and lining each of them up with a specific spiritual fear. So gluttony most commonly arises out of the fear that there's not enough. There's not enough money, time, power, love, possessions, fame, status, comfort, security. There's not enough. Lust arises out of the fear that we don't have anything to contribute to this world. Wrath arises out of the fear that we can't be the person that we were meant to be, that we can't be the unique expression of love in the world that our soul knows we are called to be. Envy arises out of the fear that we will not be loved, or has arisen out of the forgetfulness that our very nature is love. Greed arises out of the fear, and when I talk about greed, I think of it in the sense of withholding, specifically withholding our unique giftedness in the world, not being the creative expression of love that we were made to be. Greed arises out of the very real fear that we're not free to express our truth. And ultimately, that tends to connect with, if I am who I really am, people won't love me anymore. Or the social circle that I'm familiar with will reject me or banish me, or I'll be condemned or criticized for being the person that I was made to be. Sloth arises out of the fear that we don't know our truth, or our fear that we can't trust that deep inner knowing that says, I know who I am. I know why I'm here. I know what my purpose is on this plane. And pride ultimately arises out of the fear of separation. That we're separate from God, that we're separate from ourselves, that we're separate from one another, that we're separate from creation. And that old adage that pride goeth before the fall is ultimately true, because pride, or the fear of separation, is the source of all the other fears. Every other fear, spiritual fear, unhealed spiritual wound arises out of the false perception of separation. If I think I'm separate from God, then I'm separate from love. If I think I'm separate from myself, then I'm powerless. if I think I'm separate from other people, then I can be rejected. So the ultimate goal is, or desire, is to heal that wound of separation. Go straight to the source. And when we heal that wound of separation, we're healing all of the other wounds with it. And this is what Jesus was trying to say in this week's gospel, is that it's not the rituals and the practices that determine our state of well-being on this plane. It's the things that are inside of us that are coming outside of us that are our place of imprisonment. This is what keeps us, or makes us think we're separate from the love that we are and from the abundant, overwhelming, unconditional love of the divine. And if the desire is to heal that wound, there are gobs and gobs and gobs of resources and tools available to help us heal that perceived separation. And the one tool that Jesus gave us, which actually he didn't make up, it's actually a Hebrew prayer called the Kadesh, and he reformulated it, or at least the gospel writers lead us to believe that it was reformulated into what we know today as the Lord's Prayer. And I'm so grateful for the work of Aramaic scholars who have helped us to understand that the Lord's Prayer is not "Our Father who art in heaven," but is this embracing, all-encompassing, unifying prayer of oneness. And to just give you an example, the first phrase that we've heard as "Our Father who art in heaven," if we go back to the original Aramaic, Abunda Bashmaya, and translate that back into English, we get, "O thou from whom the breath of life flows and is present in all forms of vibration and light." O thou from whom the breath of life flows and is present in all forms of vibration and light. And when we allow ourselves to be present with the Aramaic Lord's Prayer, it facilitates healing of all of those unhealed wounds that we mentioned earlier. And that's what our practice is going to be today. And so I just invite you to rest, relax, close your eyes. If you want to lie down, please feel free to do that. And the version of the Aramaic Lord's Prayer that we're spending time with today is from Ashana. And it's just a beautiful, meditative, very relaxing version of the Lord's Prayer. And so we'll enter into this open to the healing and transformation that will take place simply by being present to the words, the sounds, the vibrations.